On today's episode of Locked on Wild, not only is the NHL draft coming up next week, but free agency is right around the corner. So today we're balling on a budget.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we will get a little free agency primer for you with not only the draft coming up next week, but free agency soon to follow thereafter. The Wild don't have a ton of funds to spend, and so we'll find some players that could come relatively cheap that are intriguing names to keep an eye on. Oh, and none of them are named David Perron either. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and we had a lot of requests for this in Monday night's show, just to look at some names because, you know, the prevailing theory on this show has been that, from what Danny has said, Jake Guentzel is hotly looking at Minnesota as a destination after his stint with the Carolina Hurricanes. And so we're looking at names not named Jake Guentzel or David Perron on today's show. But I want to start by just kind of setting the stage for free agency in general, because as of right now, the Minnesota Wild have $6 million in cap space. Now, if Filip Gustavsson is traded, that will push it up to just about 10. It's at $6.25 million right now. You trade Filip Gustavsson, that gets you up to 10. As far as potential holes on this roster right now, the only player who really is in need of a new deal is Declan Chisholm, which you would hope would run you somewhere around $1 million, $1.5 million. So that gets you down to about $8.5 million to play with. Whether Mason Shaw comes back, I would imagine Jake Lucchini, Alex Goligoski, Dakota Mermis probably aren't. You can fill those spots in the roster with players in the at the AHL level who, to our benefit, are all on entry-level contracts for the most part, which means that they're going to be under $1 million a piece. So if that is the approach that is used to fill a few of these roster spots, there's a little money to play with to make a little bit of an impact on this roster. The most heavily rumored spot that the Wild are looking to upgrade is that second line wing spot that Marcus Johansson marked present at for most of the season. And it's obviously a glaring need for this Minnesota Wild team, which was made painfully aware from February 7th to the end of the season. An offense that was carried by the Kirill Kaprizov line just really did not have a second line to be able to complement what the top line was doing. And so there is definitely a need. Now, I think the preference of a lot of listeners of this show would be to just see what you've got in the young prospects and give them opportunities to see if one of them can take that spot and run with it. Like we've seen, you know, I think the most interesting example to kind of compare this to is to what Wyatt Johnston did with the Dallas Stars. Now, he's playing on the third line because of the depth that the Dallas Stars roster has put together. But it's the same thing. Is he was given an opportunity, he took it, and he fully ran with it and has never looked back. And they did a little bit of that with Logan Stankoven too. And so I think people want to see something similar to that. with the Minnesota Wild this upcoming season. But for the sake of this exercise, we're going to operate under the belief that the Wild need to go get somebody to throw in and add into this mix. So I've got some names picked out, but I just want to go through the list of free agents in general, because there are some names that are just really pretty easy no's at this point. Like, obviously, Steven Stamkos, if he even leaves Tampa Bay, is not coming here. So you can cross him off the list. Sam Reinhart is going to end up making over $10 million on his new deal. So you can cross him off the list. And as a general rule of thumb, I kind of stayed away from the over 30 players because the Wild have a large number of those guys. So I stayed away from the players that are on the wrong side of 30. And some intriguing options to discuss. But again, I want to just rehash, because it's the one that has been rumored already to the Minnesota Wild. Michael Russo talked about this in Straight from the Source. And to be fair, this is just something that you could just see playing out. I'm vehemently opposed to it. But David Perron had 17 goals with Detroit this past season after 24 the year before. Has been a Wild killer throughout the course of his career, spanning from St. Louis to Edmonton to Pittsburgh to Anaheim to Vegas, back to St. Louis, and then to Detroit over the last couple of seasons as well. He's been a solid playoff performer throughout most of his career, including 16 points during the 2019 Cup run. And a couple of years ago had 9 goals and 13 points in 12 playoff games. So there's playoff pedigree there. There is the element of, if you can't beat him, join him. But he's 36. Like, he's 36 years old, and it's not to say that he couldn't be productive with the Minnesota Wild if he did sign here, but there are also odds that his numbers start to tail off because of the fact that he's 36 years old. And so I just am 100%, like, there's not even a percentage point of me being in on this. I just would be, if that's the only option you have, I would much rather just allow one of the prospects to take that spot. Like, if those are your only 2 options, I would just much rather say, all right, we're going to let one of our young prospects earn that spot and just use the entire year as an audition and see who ends up being able to slot into that spot on a more consistent basis. Maybe it's Riley Heidt. Maybe he takes the spot at a training camp and never lets it go. Maybe Liam Ogren impresses to the point that he locks that spot down solidly. There are players who could potentially slot into those spots and impress. I just don't view David Perron as one of those guys. And so I am team no. I am emphatically team no in that regard. I just think there would be much better ways to spend the money if we have to spend it. If it's, hey, we've got about $8.5 million in cap space, go spend it. There just are better ways to do that. And so that's what I'm going to do next. I've got some names picked out from the list of free agents courtesy of the soon-to-be defunct Cap Friendly. And so we're going to go through the names. I'll just go through some of the names that I like, tell you why, and look at what you could potentially get those players for. And I'll give you a hint. A few, if not all of them, will probably come in at a price point lower than David Perron. So we'll take a look at those names as we go free agency balling with a budget today on Locked on Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Ultimate Hockey GM. Hey, Locked on Wild fans, let's take a moment to bring up one of our partners, the mobile game Ultimate Hockey GM. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your hockey franchise? Do you think you could run the Minnesota Wild better than Bill Guerin currently is? Well, your dream can come true. This game is definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team. Play through the seasons and lead them to glory. Hire the right coaches and staff, trade players or draft picks, navigate through free agency and the draft, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Wild fan, you know there's no offseason. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances, and that's why you are going to love Ultimate Hockey GM. Ultimate Hockey GM is completely free and playable online. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. By the way, Locked On Network listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in the game store. So make sure to check it out. To download the game, just visit hockeygm.app. That's hockeygm.app, or look it up on the app stores. That's Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, make sure to join us tomorrow. We get a double dip for you. We'll start the day with Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod. We're taking a look at the history of the 13th overall pick in the NHL draft. We'll see how many times players have hit and how many times they have missed throughout the 13th pick to try to maybe give us a little more confidence into whoever Judd Brackett will select with that 13th overall pick. Time will tell. Tune in tomorrow. Make sure you don't miss out. All right. Free agency, Ballin on a budget. And just looking at the names that are available, as I mentioned, you're not going to get the Steven Stamkoses or the Sam Reinharts. Those players are going to be getting they're going to be getting massive deals, and honestly, I typically, in doing these exercises, I typically shy away from the restricted free agent players too, because you've got the mess with the offer sheets, and that whole thing can, and a lot of times in rare occasions, those types of players don't re-sign with their current team, so those guys usually get locked in to their current team pretty regularly. So we've got some names here. I'm going to start with a guy who is still playing. He has become, one of the cast of contributors for the Edmonton Oilers. I am talking about the likes of Warren Foegele to start things off here on this look at free agency. And if you want a little look behind the madness as to how I picked a lot of these different players, well, I filtered free agents by shots on goal. I know it's an arbitrary number, but just bear with me as to how this is going to play out. So Foegele played all 82 games for the Oilers this past season. And so far in the postseason, he's got 2 goals, 4 assists in 20 games. But if you look at Fogel's numbers this season, he had 201 shots on goal, shot 10%. Easy math. 20 goals and 201 shots. Where would 201 shots rank on the Minnesota Wild statistically this past season? Third. Well, actually fourth. Fourth behind Matt Boldy. Matt Boldy had 227 shots. Foegele would have slotted in as fourth on the team in shots with 201. He also would have been just the 6th player on the team with 20 goals. Foegele is 6'2", 198. He can play right or left wing. He's a left-hand shot. Some of the other numbers, he had 89 hits in 82 games, played just under 14 minutes per night for the Oilers. And not a huge, he handled a few faceoffs, so he is primarily a wing, left or right, and 40 giveaways, 36 takeaways. On the Corsi 4 percentage, a career high for Foegele this past season with 55.6 in the Corsi 4 department. Point shares, 2.7 on offense, 1.3 on defense, 3.9 total point shares for the Edmonton Oilers. That 3.9 mark would have ranked him in the top 10 for the Minnesota Wild this season, just ahead of Marco Rossi at 3.5. But the thing I like, shots on goal, because there are plenty of players on this team, and a lot of them aren't primary shooters. And what does that second line need? A shooter, somebody that can rip the puck on net and give this team an opportunity to add some goals. Now, is he the flashiest of players? No. Is he better than David Perron? Would I take him over David Perron? Absolutely. And his current his cap hit was $2.75 million. So a 20-goal season getting to the Stanley Cup final could be more like 3.5. But a player in Foegele who has kind of been on the rise. He started with the Hurricanes and was between a 10 and a 13-goal guy for them. 12 goals in his first year with Edmonton, 13 his second, and now has blossomed to 20 here in his third season with the Oilers. He's on the right side of 30, and so that's kind of the pitch for what Warren Foegele brings to the table. 28, nickname is McLovin, and a shooter, and that takes care of what is probably one of the big glaring holes on this team. You've got the guys like Kirill Kaprizov, you've got Matt Boldy, you've got Joel Eriksson, you've got Matt Zuccarello as kind of your primary top playmakers. Reinhart is in that list as well. But beyond that, the other guys that you have, you don't really know what you're going to get. And so adding a guy that's a shooter first is very appealing. And so Warren Foegele's the first name on my list. Another name on my list, and he slots in 15th amongst free agents with 160 shots this past season, Daniel Sprong. So one of David Perron's teammates, and he comes in having earned $2 million for his efforts in Detroit this past season, in which he scored 18 goals. He had 25 assists, 43 points in 76 games. And, not a ton. He had 3 power play goals, 9 power play assists. So he did get some power play experience, but not a ton. That's the other thing with Warren Foegele is not a huge power play guy, but he would definitely help in the even strength department, which is hugely appealing because even strength scoring for the Minnesota Wilds, that was an issue this past season. So Sprong also 160 shots on goal. He had an 11.3 shooting percentage. He scored 21 goals for Seattle last year. He's bounced around a bit. Started in Pittsburgh, then went to Anaheim, then to Washington, then to Seattle, and then to Detroit. So he's bounced around a bit. 21 goals last year in 66 games. He had 18 goals this year in 76 games, and a little bit of a dip in his shooting percentage in more shots and more games, but not egregious. 11%, 12%. That's still a good number for kind of a supporting cast player. Where did 160 shots, where would that rank on the Minnesota Wild roster? This past season, that would have been 7th, just ahead of Brock Faber, just behind Marco Rossi. So somebody that could help with that even strength scoring. And the other kind of analytical numbers for Sprong, 52.5 in the Corsi 4 percentage, which, again, above 50 is where you want to be. The higher, the better. But look at this, 3.4 offensive point shares by himself, 0.8 on defense, 4.2 total, And if we look at the point shares for the Minnesota Wild, 4.2 would have been, again, in the top 10, just above Marco Rossi. So, player who could have potentially offered quite the impact for the Minnesota Wild this season. Now, $2 million is what Sprong earned for Detroit. So somebody who, because he has bounced around a little bit, you could sign to a short-term deal. It's still going to come in under what David Perron is likely looking for. So that would be another player that could potentially have some impact for the Wilds in free agency, although I would put Foegele ahead of Daniel Sprong at this point. So again, Daniel Sprong, the other thing to like about him, he's 27, he's 6 foot 180. So he's on the right side of 30. Could be a guy that's starting to figure it out with some solid seasons here over the last couple of years. We have a couple of other names to get to here, and we'll do that after the break because I've got an intriguing player who could offer more other than scoring that I think is worth taking a look at. And of course, we've got a Vegas Golden Knight who is departing on the list as well. So we'll finish free agency balling with a budget. Some names the Wild should take a look at in free agency that could come in a little on the cheaper side. That's on the way as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. The weather is getting much nicer here as we move into the summer, which means that you can go see the Minnesota Twins at Target Field. What's better than going to Target Field, sitting outside and enjoying some of the wonderful sunshine while watching your favorite team play? Game Time can help make your game day experience as stress-free as possible. Listen to these deals that Game Time offers. They offer last-minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They offer flash deals, zone deals. You can save more when you choose a section and let Game Time choose the seats, all with their lowest price guarantee. If you find tickets that are cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder to join us for Sunday's live show. Denny will be sitting in the GM's chair, pulling the strings, making the moves. You're not going to want to miss that. Plus, we got a gigantic announcement coming for a week from Sunday. You're going to want to stay tuned to hear who is coming on the show with us on Sunday. How about that for a tease? Let's get back to the Ballin on a budget free agency. We talked about Warren Foegele, Daniel Sprong, and now I present to you a player who has gone from Boston to Anaheim to Pittsburgh, back to Boston. Still on the right side of 30. He's 28, 6'1", 188. I'm talking about Danton Heinien, who had 17 goals, 36 points this past season for the Boston Bruins, had 18 goals in 2021-2022 with the Penguins. Danton Heinien, 119 shots on goal, played 14 minutes, 28 seconds per game, 83 hits in 74 games, also had 46 blocks. On the Corsi for percentage. Now, his Corsi numbers leading into this season were good. 56% with Pittsburgh and then 52% the last two seasons. 45.6% for Boston this season. So that's not exactly where you want it, but it's not the end all be all for that type of a player. Point shares, 2.2 on offense, 1.8 on defense for 4 total. And where does 4 total rank? Based off of this year's stats, again, in the top 10 for the Minnesota Wild. 119 shots would have been 8th on the team, just ahead of Jonas Brodin. And for Danton Heinien, if we look at his statistics too, on the even strength department, he did have 1 power play goal, and so mostly an even strength scorer. But just by reading the tea leaves here, I gather he was much more of a bottom 6 guy than a middle even. And so if we're ranking based off the names that I've pulled here, I probably put him 3rd behind Foegele and Sprong. But the main point here is if you look at what he made this past year, he made $775K. So the fact that he had 17 goals, maybe he gets somewhere around $1 million and a half. That's still operating within budget parameters for this Minnesota Wild team. So Danton Heinien is another potential name on this list. Now, this one is intriguing to me because he's coming off of the Vancouver Canucks. Didn't shoot a ton, but he did end up with 18 goals and 32 points this past season in 63 games. He had 84 shots on goal, but he shot 21.4%. And I'm talking about Dakota Joshua. Now, salary-wise, he made $850K this past season. He's 28, so still on the right side of 30. But the big one for me, he's 6'3". He is a center, and he had 245 hits and 40 blocks in 63 games. So Dakota Joshua, very much able to bring you a little bit of both the hitting and the physicality and the scoring. Now, the center position is a little crowded right now, but if Bill Guerin does, which again, I think we're all pretty plainly on the don't trade Rossi, we're pretty much all on that train. If he were to, this would be a guy you could potentially get to slot in to fill one of those center spots. And again, I like the upward trajectory players. He had 11 goals last year with Vancouver. He had 18 goals this year as a 27-year-old, 200 hits in back-to-back seasons. Doesn't take a ton of face-offs, so it looks like he can play some wing as well. But then, you look at some of the peripheral numbers, the Corsi for percentage, 46.7. That's trending upwards. So even though it's under 50%, it's still trending upwards. From the point shares department, 2.3 on offense, 1.6 on defense, 3.9 total, which would rank him, again, just above Marco Rossi. But if you look at the point shares defensively at 1.6, he would rank just above Ryan Hartman for 9th on the team. And in the hits department, 245, he would have led the team by a mile in 63 games played. So it's intriguing to me because you look at a guy who can give you a little bit of both. And again, these are all, I tried to be very, very calculated with players who can give you a little something, maybe are shooters first, or can give you a little bit of both. But Dakota Joshua in this year's postseason, he had 4 goals, 4 assists in 13 games. He had 74 hits in 13 games. And I know hits, just like shots, are an arbitrary stat. But again, it points to stuff that you do on the ice. So that's another intriguing name, and it's another one that'll probably cost you around $1 million and a half. Now, the final name we'll finish with, it just wouldn't be right if we didn't talk about a Vegas Golden Knight on this list. And so we're going to talk talk about Chandler Stephenson. He's another name that has been discussed. Obviously, there's a little bit higher of a cap hit with Chandler Stephenson than there is with some of these other names on this list. Stephenson this past year had a 2.75 cap hit. 3.225 was his actual salary. But he had 16 goals, 35 assists, 51 points on 97 shots on goal. 97 shots on goal, where does that rank, you may ask? That would have been 11th, just ahead of Jake Middleton, who had 85, and just behind Freddie Gaudreau and Marcus Johansson for 10th and 9th. So again, a shooter, but what has Chandler Stephenson done? Well, in last year's postseason, he had 10 goals in 22 games and 20 total points in those 22 games. Now, this past postseason, he had 1 point. He had 1 assist in 7 games. But you look at the trajectory here. 21 goals in 79 games in 2021-2022. 16 goals in 81 games in 2022-2023. And 16 goals this past season in 75 games. As far as the other peripherals go for Stephenson, 40 blocks, 43 hits, 41 takeaways, just 18 giveaways. So he's smart with the puck. He isn't somebody that's going to just freely give it away. 16.5% shooting percentage. He's only been below 16 once in the last 4 years. So that's intriguing too. He's been right at around 17%. He only had a dip last year, but that's because he played in a career-high 81 games. The Corsi numbers, he's at 49%, so just below 50. And point shares, 2.6 on offense, 1.3 on defense, 3.8 total. And again, these are the points that you as a player individually contribute towards your team's success. So he was worth essentially 2 wins by himself. And 3.8... where does that rank based off of the Minnesota Wild's numbers this year? Again, in the top 10. That would have been just above Marco Rossi, just below Reinhart. So this one is probably the least likely because you know how Vegas operates. They'll be moving money around like crazy. And so if Stephenson wants to stay, he likely will be able to. But if he doesn't, could be intriguing to take a look at Stephenson. And Stephenson is the only player on this list that is over 30. He is 6', 209, and is a center as well. So I should discuss the faceoff numbers. This year, he won 52.6% of his faceoffs after winning 58% last season and played 18 minutes, 29 seconds per game this past year. So again, these are all players that... and it's not to say that David Perron wouldn't be asking for less. These are all players that are younger than David Perron. These are all players that would cost less. And these are all players that could potentially give you more. So it's whether or not the Wild actually go for any of these guys remains to be seen. But there are some intriguing names, at least, for the Wild to keep an eye on in free agency. So that will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we got a double dip coming up for you. We'll be talking with Isha Jerome of the Soda Pod to lead things off about the history of the 13th overall pick in the NHL draft. And then I will give you some additional draft profiles in the afternoon. We'll be draft heavy leading up to the draft next week. So we'll try to get as many of those to you as we can. So we have an idea as to who is going to potentially be there for the Wild at 13. Make sure to hit the like button on today's episode and make sure to subscribe. We don't ask for anything in return, but if you subscribe to Locked On Wild on YouTube, you can be the first to know when new episodes are going to drop throughout the week. And even though we're in the off season right now, we got a bunch of content coming for you, especially once the season hits. So you're going to want to take this opportunity to subscribe so you don't miss out. And so you get those episodes before everybody else does. Also, make sure to follow us on your favorite audio platforms, wherever you tune in, whether it's on the couch, on your laptop, on your phone, or in the car. We thank you for making Locked On Wild part of your listening pleasure throughout the day. We have new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.